The girl was eating a boxed meal at home when suddenly the room shook violently. She hesitated for a moment but didn't pay much attention to it. However, when she returned home from work a month later, she found that her neighbor had been brutally murdered in their home. At that moment, she felt an overwhelming sense of fear because she felt that her neighbor's death seemed to be directly related to her. The girl's name was Ellie. Not long ago, she was a single woman living in a bustling city. Her life seemed to be the same as most young people. Ellie's daily routine consisted of work, and the rest of the time was spent on her phone. Her headphones blocked out all sounds except her own. Even when the neighbor greeted her warmly, she would always intentionally avoid them. Her biggest hobby was grabbing a cheap takeaway on her way home from work, then sitting in her room eating and watching variety shows until the alarm clock rang the next morning, and she would put her phone back in her pocket and repeat the monotony of another day. In fact, Ellie hadn't been renting a place. She had been living in her mother's house. When her mother passed away from illness, the house naturally came into Ellie's name. But then her father, who had been absent for 17 years, suddenly reappeared. Ellie had to either choose to live with him or give up her inheritance and leave the house. Ellie understood her father's intentions, but she was unwilling to live with him. So, she decisively gave up the property that was rightfully hers. She had always depended on her mother since childhood and had never forgiven the father who had abandoned her. After that, Ellie rented a place and planned to start a new, quiet life here. Ellie worked as a receptionist in a company. Her job was to handle customer inquiries and complaints, no matter how emotional the other party was. The company required her to show no personal feelings at all. Over time, the mechanical nature of her work left her with almost no emotional fluctuations, until one day, she smelled a terrible stench coming from her neighbor's apartment. That was when her life began to stir. Before going to work, she called the landlord to report the situation. The smell from the neighbor's apartment had spread throughout the entire hallway, but when she returned from work, she found the police had already sealed off the area. It was only then that she learned from the landlord that her neighbor had been dead for several days. It turned out that the neighbor was the man who always hung around in the hallway. He had no friends or family, so it wasn't until the smell of his decomposing body spread that anyone finally noticed. Ellie suddenly remembered the shaking in her apartment a few days ago. That must have been the day the neighbor got hurt. This sudden turn of events made Ellie feel very distressed, and she even began to question her attitude toward life. If she hadn't ignored it that night, perhaps this tragedy could have been avoided. At that moment, she couldn't help but think of her family. But now, aside from her deceased mother, she only had her emotionally distant father left. In the end, she opened the surveillance footage from her mother's house, trying to check on her father's current condition.